Hi, welcome to Physionic, where we learn the body from the macro to the micro. If that's something you think you'd be interested in, then consider subscribing. Today, guys, we're going to be talking about fat, but we're also going to be talking about your skeleton. And I will say that this is one of the coolest papers that I have ever read. So I'm especially excited to discuss this particular paper. And we are going to delve into how your skeletal system, yes, your bones, have control, or at least partial control, over your fat. So, without further ado, in a short, sweet, science-based video, let's go ahead and jump into this content. Briefly, to explain what this paper is about, it's essentially a paper that's going to try, and we will see if they succeed based on your interpretation of the data, our interpretation of the data, trying to determine how the skeletal system might have a modulatory impact on our fat mass. So we may eat more and gain more weight based off of our skeletal system. So they're going to explain exactly why and how that might be the case. Now let's briefly discuss the experimental approach that was used in this particular study. So there are 3 points that I'd like to emphasize. The first is that this study was done in rodents, so mice and rats. The second point is that they loaded one group of rodents with 15% extra weight. So 15% of their body weight was added on top of their original body weight, their biological weight. So you might see that reference throughout the paper of biological weight. That would be the weight that would be independent, so not including the 15% addition of this load that they put onto the rodents. So then the rodents have to carry that extra weight around. But again, that is non-biological, therefore it is not fat mass, skeletal mass, muscle mass of any sort. And the final point being that the rats and mice were fed ad libitum, meaning that they were allowed to eat whatever amount that they wanted. So they had free reign over how much they ate. Let's jump into the experimental results. This is going to be extremely interesting. We're going to be taking a lot of different figures on, but we're not going to be covering every single figure because some of them can be redundant and some of them are just kind of proofs of what we're actually seeing. So they're kind of secondary measures to prove that the initial measure is the correct measure. So I'm going to just cover particular figures, but of course I encourage you to look at all of them because you can read through that paper yourself. So figure 1A and B are essentially the same thing, but for mice and rats. So again, because we're looking at rodents, we're looking at two different populations of rodents. It doesn't really matter what type of rodents that we're using in this situation, but just rest assured that they're very commonly used rodents. Actually, in research that I've done myself, I've used these rodents as well. So they looked at body weight. So they looked at specifically, again, biological body weight. So how much of a difference do you see between the control animals, the animals that weren't loaded with an extra 15% of that artificial weight, and that's what I'll reference it as, artificial weight, and compared to the manipulated animals, which did have that 15% added weight on there. And what you'll find is really interesting right off the bat. Right away, you see a significant difference in the amount of weight lost between one condition and the other condition. So the control animals weighed more or lost less weight than the ones that were loaded, and it's pretty significant. Now for figures 1C and D, those are essentially the same. One is more of a visual representation, but the second one is a bar graph version of what we're actually looking at. And what you'll again notice really interestingly is that the loaded condition, so with those artificial weights, that extra 15% body weight, led to a decrease in white adipose tissue. Now, at this point, you might be thinking there's a trend here going, and we're going to investigate what that trend might be. Now, I have certain thoughts on what that could be, but they actually address those thoughts, and it's not what I initially thought. I initially thought that these animals were just expending more energy, but we'll see that that is not the case. The next figure, 1E, looks at leptin levels. So you can imagine that with lower leptin levels, which is actually what we see here, we see lower leptin levels with the loaded condition, the artificial weight condition, which would then imply that those animals would eat more. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because we just talked about how the biological weight is actually lower for those animals, and actually pretty significantly lower. So oddly enough, even though leptin is low and substantially lower than in control animals, which would imply that those animals would want to eat more, you're seeing a reduction in body weight. So let's look at the actual consumption and see what's happening there. So here we are, we're at figure 1F, and figure 1F shows that leptin levels are lower, yes, from figure 1E, but when we look at the actual consumption numbers, they're consuming less. So that leads us to essentially two possible conclusions. One, that leptin research up to this point, through all the various studies that have looked at leptin over the years, are incorrect. Or alternatively, number two, that there are other mechanisms that control our consumption patterns and our body weight patterns. And that's essentially what this paper is trying to prove. So we're going to see how that develops over time. Now, as a supplementary point, I decided to look at another figure in their supplementary index, which they reference throughout the paper. So they mentioned that food intake was substantially reduced for the loaded condition, the artificial weight condition. However, then I was also interested in what initially brought me to this conclusion that I had up to this point, that maybe there's a change in expenditure, that you're seeing an increase in expenditure. And they looked at VO2, which is an indirect way of looking at expenditure, of caloric energy expenditure, and you'll see that there is no difference in caloric expenditure. So the only difference is a reduction in consumption. Now looking at figure 2B, so I'm skipping ahead. So they also looked at mice that had a knockout of leptin. So they don't produce leptin, or they produce minimal amounts of leptin. And what they find is that the exact same trend is true in that situation as well. So even if you're looking at control animals without leptin versus manipulated animals without leptin, you still see that trend. And what's interesting about that is if you reintroduce leptin, leptin has a contradictory effect. But like I said, leptin does not seem to be the only driver of appetite, but it does seem to still have an effect on appetite, and that's what this graph shows. Now in this figure, which is another supplementary figure that they provide, is a microscopy image of osteocyte knockout. So they used particular animals that they could use a selective knockout process, meaning that they can selectively knock out at a later date particular cells, and they're especially targeting osteocytes, so which are the bone regulatory cells. So you can see that the bone regulatory cells in one condition, in the knockout condition, are far more apoptotic, meaning that they undergo far more cell death than in the non-knockout condition, in which you might see a little bit just because that's normal physiology, but it certainly pales in comparison to the knockout model. So now let's move on to figure 3, 3A and 3B, and this is where things start getting really interesting, is because initially on the very first figure I showed you that you see a reduction in body weight if you have this artificial weight that's kind of hunkered onto these particular animals. But in this condition, they've knocked out the osteocytes, which is what I just discussed one figure ago. So once they've knocked out these osteocytes, you see a rebound in weight. So when you're knocking out these cells, these particular cells of the skeletal system, you're seeing a rebound of the weight right back up to its control level. So as if it didn't have that homeostatic system to modulate appetite. So now we have a link between osteocyte specific and the appetite regulation that we talked about earlier. That is independent of leptin and could be argued potentially to be more influential than leptin itself. So that's pretty exciting. So in this particular figure, they also wanted to look at leptin again. I mean, which makes sense. If you're going to look at it in the first figure, then you probably want to look at it when you do this really impactful manipulation by knocking out these osteocytes. And what they find is that leptin then rebounds. Now, is that because the osteocytes are having a direct impact on leptin? I would argue no. It's most likely because you are seeing this rebound in body weight, which means that you need this consumption of food to increase. And if you have the consumption of food to increase, your adipocytes will fill more, and therefore your leptin levels will then increase back up to their basal state. And then I went again to the supplementary page because I wanted to look at a particular graph that looked at neuronal expressions that express our satiety levels and our hunger levels, hunger cues, neuropeptides, things of that nature. And this particular graph looks at exactly that. So they looked at mRNA levels, so looked at transcription levels from genes. And what they found is that in these two particular neuropeptides, you see a change with the loading. So if you have a loaded condition, animals that have that 15% body weight artificial load, you see a change in the expression of these neuropeptides. So the hunger aspects, because of this loaded condition, are changed just because, and at this point now we know, because of, or at least partly because of, these osteocytes are having some sort of regulatory impact on our hypothalamus. So this final supplementary figure is a really, really impressive one because they looked at knockouts of 4 different hunger cues. So they looked at a knockout for ghrelin, so completely getting rid of ghrelin and seeing what happens. They used a knockout for GLP-1, which is glucagon-like peptide, a melanocortin knockout, as well as an estrogen knockout. So let's investigate each one of these hormones real quick. So quick background on these hormones. So ghrelin is essentially the antithesis of insulin, and it tends to be upregulated when you haven't consumed food in some time. It makes us hungrier, and it changes a lot of different metabolic properties. Now, aside from that, GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide, is also secreted, and it is secreted from the intestinal tract. So the intestinal tract is essentially sending a signal that would then have an impact on our metabolism and have an impact on our hunger cues as well. Melanocortin is tightly related to cortisol secretion, which also has an impact on our hypothalamus, which that particular part of our brain has an impact, or is essentially the regulatory site for our hunger cues, as well as many other systems. And finally, estrogen, which seems a little odd, but estrogen actually also has an impact on our hunger cues. When it binds to particular cells, can induce the release of ghrelin, which is the very first knockout that we looked at. So what exactly do these graphs tell us? Well, if you knock out each one of these conditions, if you knock out each one of these hunger cues, you see a decrease in body weight. So presumably, most likely, based off of the previous data that we looked at, we don't see a change in the expenditure, but we do see a change in the intake of food. So that makes sense. If you knock out the hunger cues that cue us to eat, then you're going to eat less. But what's really interesting about this, and that's not exactly shocking to see a decrease in hunger, but you see a massive further decrease in hunger when you add that loaded condition. With that artificial load in those rodents, that osteocyte is having an even greater impact on knocking down those hunger cues. So loading the skeleton plus the knockout of each one of these hunger cues leads to massive drops in hunger and therefore substantial decreases in body weight. So let's discuss some of these findings. Now, I've touched on a few figures and what those figures could mean and things of that nature. So one, clearly a non-adipose, non-lean tissue weight that's added to the skeletal system leads to a reduction in our consumption of food, which leads to a reduction in our biological weight. That is pretty profound and something pretty new that I have never heard of before, but it seems to be the case. So our skeleton does have an impact on our adiposity, on our fat mass, through the effect on the hypothalamus, that region of our brain that tells us to eat or not eat. The second point is feeding into that first point, that the osteocytes specifically, and that doesn't necessarily mean that other systems can't also feed into this, but they only looked at osteocytes, that those bone regulatory cells have an impact through their impact on the hypothalamus. And that is independent, and keep that in mind, independent of the effects that leptin has, ghrelin has, GLP-1, etc., etc. So all these other hunger cues. That does not mean that those hunger cues are not important and those don't have a substantial impact. It's just that this new system seems to have a profound impact. So there we have it, folks. I really think this is the coolest paper that I have read, certainly, well, this year, but it's only been a month into the year, but for the Examine series. I do think that this is the coolest paper because it really redefines how we think about food regulation and things of that nature, how we gain weight. It certainly doesn't redefine thermodynamics. It sticks to that principle because the overall expenditure stays the same, but the overall intake reduces. So in that situation, and with artificial weight and the load that's put on the skeleton. So the big takeaway from this is that maybe it's not just lifting weights, but actually putting load on your skeleton, onto your legs, and walking and things of that nature may have a more profound impact than we once thought, especially when it comes to our appetite regulation. So again, I really hope that you found this informative, and if you did, then I would certainly hope that I have the pleasure of speaking with you in the very next one. Have a good one, guys. See ya.